Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really foundational topic for anyone studying psychology.
Absolutely. Or even just trying to understand people in our, super connected world.
We're doing a deep dive into cultural bias in psychology
Yeah, we've got a bunch of notes and some excerpts here that really dig into this challenge. It's about looking at how psychology started out.
and how it often had this big blind spot for culture's influence.
Exactly. So our mission today, we want to unpack what cultural bias actually is
Figure out why it became so embedded in the field, see how it affects research, how it affects clinical practice.
and look at what's being done about it. For you listening, if you're studying psychology, this is really essential stuff.
Totally essential.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What even is culture?
Well, the material we're looking at defines it as a shared way of life.
A way of life. So that's things like values, beliefs, behaviors, traditions.
All of it, yeah. Passed down through generations. It's basically the lens through which people see and interact with their world.
Okay. And historically, psychology didn't really develop everywhere equally, did it?
Not at all. It largely came out of Western countries, the U.S., Europe mainly.
And the people they studied back then.
Often a pretty specific group, white, educated, middle-class folks, generally.
So a really narrow slice of humanity to begin with?
Right, and that directly created this problem. Cultural bias. Other cultures, they were often just ignored or seriously underrepresented in that early work.
The consequence being,
Well, the big one was that theories developed based on that limited group were often just assumed to be universal, like they apply to everyone everywhere.
regardless of their cultural background. Which, thinking about it now, feels, well, obviously flawed.
It does.
Yeah.
But why did it happen? What were the reasons for this sort of tunnel vision?
Good question.
The sources point to a few things. One is ethnocentrism.
Okay, define that.
It's basically seeing your own culture as the standard.
Yeah.
Sometimes even viewing other cultures as, less developed, maybe primitive, or just not worth studying seriously.
That's a bit uncomfortable to hear, but I guess it was a common view back then.
Unfortunately, yes, across many fields, not just psychology. Then there were practical issues.
Like what?
Just the sheer difficulty of doing cross-cultural research. It's expensive, it takes a lot of time.
Logistics must be a nightmare. Translation, finding local experts, getting access.
Exactly, it's a massive undertaking. And then there was a third factor, which feels almost naive now.
Which was?
Just assuming universality,
Mhm.
genuinely believing that the way things worked in your culture was just the way things worked for all humans, period.
So if you believe that, you don't see the need to look elsewhere.
Precisely. Why bother with all that complex cross-cultural stuff if you think you already have the universal answer? This really shaped research methods.
Ah, methods. Okay, this brings us to John Barry, right? And his Adic versus emic idea.
Exactly. From 1969, the ADIC approach. That's basically where the universal assumption gets applied in research design.
So you take a theory or a test developed in, say, America, and you just apply it directly somewhere else, assuming it works and means the same thing, like a memory test example.
Just like that. Take a test made for U.S. students,
Mhm.
give it to people in a totally different cultural context, and score it using the U.S. norms.
Now, is there any justification for that? Are some things universal?
Well, the argument is, yes, some things might be. Basic biology, maybe some core cognitive functions, some fundamental emotions. Our basic physiology doesn't vary culturally, right?
Okay, fair point. But the downsides seem huge.
They really are. The biggest risk is ignoring how culture shapes the meaning of behavior. You end up imposing your own cultural understanding where it doesn't fit.
That's the imposed etic you mentioned.
Just the term, yeah. And it means your findings might just lack validity in that other culture. They might not measure what you think they're measuring at all.
Okay, so that leads us to the alternative, the emic approach.
Right. Emick flips it. It's about studying behavior from within a specific culture.
Trying to understand it on its own terms.
Exactly. Using concepts and methods that are actually meaningful to the people in that culture.
So instead of just using my standard American memory tests,
You'd first try to figure out, well, how does this specific culture think about memory? How do they value it? What does it look like in their daily lives? You work from their perspective.
the advantages seem pretty clear then. You avoid that imposed and heretic risk.
Definitely. You capture behaviors that are actually significant there, and your interpretations are much more likely to be culturally sensitive, more accurate.
Sounds much better. But does the emic approach have limitations too?
It can, yeah. One potential issue is you might focus so much on what's unique about that culture.
That you miss the common ground. The things humans do share across cultures.
Potentially, yes. And another really important point, it can risk overlooking diversity within the culture itself.
Ah, right. Just because you study culture X doesn't mean everyone in culture X is the same.
Absolutely not. So if an emic study leads you to claim, say, culture A is more generous than culture B, you're falling into stereotyping.
You're ignoring all the individual variations inside both culture A and culture B.
Exactly. Which brings us to bias within cultures, not just between them.
Like subcultural bias.
Yes, the material talks about that. Like doing research in London.
And then saying the findings apply to the whole UK.
Right. Ignoring huge differences between city life and rural life, or different ethnic communities, social classes, regional identities within the UK itself.
It's easy to see how that happens. And the sources mention other types too, like relationship research.
Yeah, studies focusing only on heterosexual couples, but then talking about couples in general.
Yeah.
That marginalizes or just ignores same-sex relationships, applying findings where they might not fit.
Which sounds similar to issues around gender bias in psychology.
Very similar concepts. The notes mention alpha bias and beta bias.
Okay, alpha bias.
That's exaggerating differences, like pushing stereotypes, men are naturally aggressive, women naturally nurturing, often without good evidence.
And beta bias is the opposite.
Yeah, minimizing or just ignoring differences. Like doing research only on men and just assuming it applies equally to women, which often isn't the case.
And then there's androcentrism.
Which is like ethnocentrism, but for gender. It positions male behavior as the norm, the default standard.
And female behavior is seen as what? Different, less important.
Often, yeah. As a deviation from that male norm, it's another way one group's experience gets treated as the universal standard.
Okay, let's make this more concrete. Thinking about those classic studies many of us learn about, ASH.
Right, Ash's 1951 conformity studies, famously used only American male university students.
So how might that bias things?
Well, think about applying those findings about conforming to group pressure directly to a highly collectivist culture.
Where group harmony might be way more important than individual independence.
Exactly. You'd expect conformity levels or motivations might be very different. So Ash's specific findings weren't necessarily universal.
Or even just applying them outside a specific Western university setting.
Sure, different social dynamics exist everywhere. Then there's Milgram's obedience study.
1963. Also just American participants, right? Even though he was initially thinking about Nazi Germany.
Correct. So again, assuming those specific findings about obedience to authority apply globally, well, it overlooks potentially massive cultural differences.
Differences in how people view authority, how much obedience is valued.
And unique historical context, like the one in Germany that partly inspired him. It shows how context matters.
These examples really highlight why this isn't just, an academic debate for psychology students. It has real impact.
Huge real-world consequences. The sources give some powerful clinical examples. Cochrane and Sachit Heron's work in the UK, for instance.
What did they find?
They found that Black Caribbean people in the UK were being diagnosed with schizophrenia at a rate far, far higher than white people.
Okay.
But here's the crucial part. Rates of schizophrenia in the Caribbean aren't especially high.
Wow. So that suggests it's not biological.
It strongly points towards cultural misunderstanding or bias in the UK's diagnostic process. Maybe clinicians were misinterpreting culturally specific behaviors or expressions of distress.
Seeing them through a Western lens and pathologizing them, that's really concerning.
It is. And then Littlewood and Lipsedge found something else in 1989.
What was that?
That even when Black Caribbean patients had similar symptoms to white patients, they were often prescribed stronger medications.
Seriously. So the bias affects treatment decisions, too.
Clearly, it shows how these biases can lead to unequal care, potentially over-medicalizing certain groups. These aren't just errors in theory, they affect real people's health and lives.
So, okay, researchers become aware of this. They try to do cross-cultural research, but it's still really hard to get right, isn't it?
Oh, incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
The sources mention ongoing challenges, like simple interpretation issues.
Beyond just basic language barriers.
Yeah. Idioms, nonverbal communication, cultural practices. Things just don't translate directly. It's so easy to misinterpret something, even with the best intentions.
And end up drawing slightly ethnocentric conclusions anyway.
It's a constant risk. You might think you're comparing the same concept, but the cultural nuances mean you're actually comparing different things entirely.
Like apples and culturally significant pomegranates, as you said before.
Something like that. And then there's the issue of replicability. Science relies on it.
Being able to repeat a study and get similar results.
Right. But how do you replicate a study perfectly across different languages, different countries, different cultural settings?
Seems almost impossible. Smith and Bond pointed this out years ago, didn't they?
They did back in '88. They argued that perfect cross-cultural replication is basically unattainable because you have to make changes in translation or procedures.
So, given this history, these difficulties, what's the way forward? How is psychology trying to tackle cultural bias?
Well, the awareness is definitely much higher now, and the sources outline key strategies. One big one is cultural relativism,
Which means,
fundamentally recognizing that behavior only really makes sense within its cultural context.
so there's no single normal. What's considered normal or adaptive depends on the culture.
Exactly. It's a crucial shift in perspective. Another key step is better sampling.
Moving beyond those narrow groups from the past.
Yes. Making a real effort to include participants from all relevant subgroups in research, not just different ethnicities, but gender, age, socioeconomic status, urban-rural differences, the whole spectrum.
Capturing actual human diversity, the notes mention Margaret Mead.
Right. Her work in Papua New Guinea in 1935 was an early attempt to look beyond her own culture, studied 3 different tribes.
But the point was, even that could have been broader.
Yeah, the suggestion is studying even more diverse groups would have made her findings even more robust, less prone to overgeneralizing from just those 3. It's about breadth.
Okay. And finally, linking back to Barry's ideas, context and local involvement.
Yes, doing research in culturally meaningful settings, and crucially, involving local researchers from within that culture.
Why is that so important?
They bring invaluable understanding. They can help make sure the questions asked, the methods used, and the way results are interpreted are actually appropriate and sensitive to the local context. It helps avoid imposing outside views.
Right, avoiding that imposed ALEC again. So, to wrap this up, cultural bias, it seems, wasn't always intentional malice.
No, often it grew out of a historical context, practical limits, and maybe some naive assumptions of early psychology.
But its effects on the validity of research and especially on real people's lives through things like diagnosis and treatment, those effects are significant.
Absolutely. And as psychology aims to be a truly global science, well, embracing diversity isn't just nice to have,
It's essential.
it's non-negotiable. Respecting cultural differences, building inclusion into methods and theories, that's the only way forward.
The only way to get a genuinely comprehensive picture of human behavior in all its amazing variety.
And for you, listening, especially if you're studying psychology, really grappling with this history and these ongoing challenges is so important. It helps you critique what you're learning.
And think about how you might contribute differently in the future.
Exactly. So maybe a final thought for you to take away. As you learn about different psychological theories, or maybe diagnostic criteria,
Ask yourself, could cultural bias be hiding in there somewhere? What assumptions are being made?
what questions could you ask? Whose perspectives might be missing? And thinking ahead.
How could you, in your own studies or future work, help make psychology more culturally sensitive, more globally aware?
Something to keep considering as you continue your own deep dive into understanding the human mind.